Hello, welcome to this session, The Great British Energy Crisis. I'm Rob Lyons and I'm Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas. Labour has set out enormously ambitious plans to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2030, just 6 years away, prioritising renewable energy sources like wind and solar power while reducing the nation's dependence on fossil fuels. But there are plenty of commentators warning about the feasibility and impact of this strategy. Renewable energy, while crucial to achieving decarbonisation, is notoriously unpredictable. Moreover, most of the UK's nuclear power stations, which have long provided a steady and reliable source of low-carbon electricity, are set to close between 2026 and 2030. Will Labour's energy strategy lead to a cheaper, more secure electricity supply, as the government claims? Or are we on the brink of an energy crisis, with higher costs and increasing vulnerability to blackouts? Are higher bills a price worth paying to tackle climate change? Or, when global emissions are still climbing, a pointless sacrifice of British jobs and living standards? So that's roughly the kind of terrain we might want to be talking about. I've got a fantastic panel to discuss this. First to speak is, on my left, is Lord David Frost. He's a member of the House of Lords, probably most famous as the UK's Brexit negotiator, but also a columnist at the Telegraph, where he's written about net zero policies quite a few times. Then on David's left is Professor Dr. Michaela Kendall. She's the CEO of Adelan, the UK hydrogen champion for mission innovation for the UK government. Then over there on the right is James Woudhuysen. He's visiting Professor of Forecasting and Innovation at London South Bank University. And among many other things, he's co-author of a book called Energize, which is all about the future of energy. And finally, on my near right is Dr. Shahrar Ali, a former deputy leader of the Green Party, and I imagine that Green Party suggests a certain outlook, environmental outlook. So we've got a really good range of speakers and viewpoints to kick this discussion off. So without any further ado, David, would you like to say your piece?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Rob. Thank you for having me here. Just to kick off, there's so much that can be said, and I just want to focus on three things, I guess. First of all, what's the starting point for the Labour government on net zero? What can we expect of Ed Miliband, and where is that going to take us? And third, what should sceptics of net zero, of which I admit I'm one, what should we actually do over the next few years, given the politics? So, first of all, what's the starting point? I mean, my view is we're in the middle of a policy that's built on a fundamental misconception, which is the belief that we're facing an environmental catastrophe which only reordering our whole societies can deal with, rather than, as I believe it is, a problem which ordinary policymaking can manage. And I think it's also based on a fallacy, which is that you can operate advanced modern societies which are good for human welfare and flourishing without lots and lots of energy. And in my view, you just can't do that, and the evidence points to that. So the policy that we're on already is already having a damaging effect. Energy and electricity consumption is falling in the UK and in the EU, and is actually beginning to in the US too. We've got the highest electricity prices in the world in the UK. EU is not far behind. And all this is, in my view, a big part of the declining productivity and growth, deindustrialization, export of carbon emissions to the rest of the world. And it's built on a series of misconceptions and, I would say, deceits in places to make it palatable. The belief that the net zero program will actually generate growth. I don't believe it will. I think it's likely to be a drag on growth, but we're told to believe that will increase growth. The belief that renewable costs are falling rather than what they actually are, which is rising. A good assessment of the actual accounts and costs of solar and wind shows they're at least 50% above the government's predictions in 2023 and going the wrong way. There's an assumption that major problems like intermittency are just going to be solved somehow without there being solutions. And in the discourse, there are a lot of elementary economic errors, like counting jobs as a benefit and a cost, assuming there's nothing else you can do with all the capital that's going into net zero, and so on and so forth. And finally, we've taken a non-market approach to doing this. Instead of pricing carbon, allowing the market to work it out best, we've got a very dirigiste policy in place already, lots and lots of targets. So in a way, we've got the worst of both worlds. We haven't got a free market. We haven't got effective government direction or centralisation either. So it's a mess. That's the first answer to my first question. Second, what can we expect of Labour? So I gave a lecture for the Global Warming Policy Foundation last year called Not Dark Yet, but it's getting there. And I predicted that as the costs and the contradictions grew, governments would do one of two things. Either they would sort of slow down with all this pay lip service to the targets, but in practice not act accordingly with them. Or they would recognise they were stuck on the targets and they double down on the catastrophism and the crisis. Now, I think we might be seeing across the EU the first of those, but here in the UK, we're definitely seeing the beginnings of the second of those. And the Labour government seems to have no clear strategy other than sort of do everything and spend as much as is necessary. And so we've lost the last coal plant, we've got the solar farms covering fields, we've got the closing down of the North Sea, and so on and so forth. And you have to feel the government doesn't quite know how to go about this. Does it really believe in its own target? It's doubling down on the irrationality. And I know Dieter Helm, who is obviously much more climate worried by the climate issue than I am, wrote this week, the government trots out nonsense about getting away from high and volatile gas fossil fuel prices. It makes silly statements like the claim that renewables are 10 times cheaper. What is the storage strategy? That's another element of this, not even mentioned in this famous letter from Ed Miliband to the head of NESO. So it's simply not been solved. There's much more reliance on interconnectors, and that's a big worry for me. I've been burned when I was in number 10 by the experience of the competition between European governments over vaccines, the attempt to cut off electricity to Jersey that we were threatened with in 2021. I believe that when the chips are down, governments look to their own people first, and why shouldn't they? So reliance on interconnectors is a risky strategy in crisis. So the only possible effect of all of this is more costs, more expensive energy, more subsidies, less security, more strain on the grid, which I suspect will show up as rationing rather than blackouts, to be honest, at least in the short run. And more of the same, slower growth, slower productivity, lower investment, more lifestyle preaching and control, and more social conflict. So finally, and just briefly, what is the right thing to do for people who are sceptical about all this? And I would say 5 things. First of all, keep talking, keep underlining about the extent to which the UK is now an outlier on policy, on prices, on deindustrialisation, and so on, and keep talking about the costs. Second, push out the sensible alternative, which in my view is gas to nuclear, is dismantling the subsidies and price supports, is pausing the renewable programmes, getting back towards the market. Third, it's keep denouncing the current policy. The more fragile the current policy is, the more private sector will be reluctant to invest in it, the less that will get done, and the starting point for correcting it will be easier. Fourth, really important to oppose the byproducts of renewables, the pylons, the cables, the onshore wind farms, solar. All these are part of the problem. They damage the environment for no good reason. Don't fall into the trap of some in the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard community, who say building anything is good. Building houses is good. Building wind farms in the countryside, building cables, pylons for them is not good, and we shouldn't feel bad about opposing them. Finally, stop paying lip service to the climate catastrophe. I think the evidence shows climate change is a problem. It isn't an existential one. And the catastrophism is designed to make us fearful, accepting of the remodelling of our societies. I think we can and we will adapt as long as we don't destroy our economies on the way. Thank you.
Michaela from.
Thank you. Yes, and just on the title of the talk, is that better? Yeah. Just on the title of the talk, I don't believe there is an energy crisis, actually. I believe there's an energy management crisis, which is a slightly different thing. I don't want people to frighten you, and I don't want to put any misinformation into this talk whatsoever, so I'm going to focus on facts. I'm a scientist. I focus on numbers and facts. It's actually manageable through good policy making and technology. So politics are actually ruling this UK debate on energy. And that's, for a scientist, that's really obvious. So we need to have a more democratic press. We need to have more public debates like this. And I think this event last year was a real eye-opener for me. So the first point is, I don't believe there's an energy crisis. The second point is, last year was a baptism of fire for me coming to this event because it was really helpful to hear this debate going on. The debate format is incredibly valuable because you get to hear things from people and get to question them, and then we get to debate it amongst ourselves. And that is the way to engage and to educate and to exchange. So for me, this is a really valuable experience, and I hope everybody in the room finds it that way today. As I was discussing with Helen Pankhurst a couple of weeks ago, we still need more women involved in policy making and more female technologists in this debate as well. I still can't believe the Pankhursts are still calling for female emancipation in the UK, but I'm hoping that this will eventually happen. We do have 40% of our MPs now who are female. However, it takes more than that because we are living in a technological age and we need more female techies out there, and we need to encourage women into it, not put them off through violence and threats on the internet. So women and men both have to stand up for women in tech, or we have to face the social consequences. And I think actually part of this debate is part of the social consequences. So, number 3, we need more facts in this debate. And as a scientist, I rely on facts. I look at numbers all day long. I don't really care so much about opinion. I'm much more interested in the facts. So I hope we can exchange those today. Nobody's objective. Not one in the panel is objective. No one in the room is objective. No expert, no politician. We're all subjective. But ideally, through this forum, we can iron out that subjectivity and create an objective opinion. But there are colossal vested interests in energy, and we have to recognise that. We have to understand that these resources are applied to lobby politicians, to misinform people through the press, and to muddy the waters of public debate. So this is why this today is so valuable, and I welcome every question and criticism and hope that we can go through it together. But we also need to encourage disruptors. We need people who will say, hold on a minute, I don't believe that, I want to question it. So that's really invaluable. That's always invaluable in science, it's always invaluable in politics. So the fourth thing, the only way to excavate key facts in this debate is for transparency. I'm looking for transparency in public funding of energy. I've never seen it. I've tried to get it. I've tried to get it in academia. I cannot get it. And I think that's what unites everybody in this room. We're all frustrated by that lack of transparency, and we're actually unable to hold people accountable because we can't actually get to the facts. So we need to demand it, and that is something that we can all do and unite around. There is subsidy in energy everywhere, and we have to understand that. Some of it's historical, it's not purposeful, but it is historical, and it's certainly not focused on renewables. But renewables get subsidy too, don't get me wrong. We have to hold those people accountable for refusing to provide transparency on all subsidy. And then we need to engage expertise, we need to look academics, industrialists, and politicians to create good policy. Winston Churchill had a phrase, we want scientists on tap, not on tap, not on top. And I think that phrase has aged very, very badly in an age of technology. So the fifth point is we cannot repeat these past mistakes. We have made terrible mistakes as a country because we all know in this room that Britain invents things and then we offshore it for somebody else to make money from it. That's what we've done traditionally. Everybody understands that. And everybody, by the way, that I speak to understands that around the world too. So Britain has to give up that habit of invention and shipping it out just at the point it makes money. And on that point, the green economy is the second fastest growing sector in the UK. Technology is number one. We can't now turn our back on technology and say, no, we don't want anything like that here. 97% of our solar in the UK and in Europe is installed from China. So we invented the technology, we developed it, and then we shipped it out. China didn't take it from us. We actually wanted to do that, and America did it also. Lithium was discovered in Britain, and yet we refused to develop the technology. With hydrogen technology, we can't just make the same mistake again. This is foolish to offshore billions per year, as we're doing at the moment. So it's not really a drag on growth if we have to keep it here. It should be a source of growth. And we need to invest. Thank you. We need to invest in sovereign capability in energy. That means we're not reliant on imports of technologies from China or anywhere else. We have to be making the net zero products that we say we need. And that is a good investment. Even if we don't say everything has got to be net zero technologies, it will be part of the portfolio because that is one of the fastest growing sectors in the world right now. So that actually represents good economic policy. We need to level up the playing field across all of those technologies. Certain technologies do get more than others. I have not been able to find how much goes into nuclear energy because despite my questions to government, I've never been told. But it's roughly around £40 billion per year that goes into nuclear science, and that's public funding. That's not private funding. So I'm interested in looking at those numbers and comparing that with hydrogen, which I know it's roughly around 15 million per year, possibly 20 million. But compared to the 40 billion of public resource that we're spending on nuclear, there's a lot of subsidy going into nuclear as far as I can see.
Okay. Thank you very much. James.
Well, since I'm supposed to know about innovation, I thought I'd try to bring you some innovation today and try to explain why is David Ed Miliband so willfully stupid? Why is... That's an opinion, as Michaela would say, and so you mustn't clap it. But I'm bound to say that facts alone, like the intermittency of renewables, or the fact that Britain is only responsible for 1% of emissions, don't cut it really in political debate. That's a problem, Michaela, I had with pure facts, right? I'll leave aside the fact that the green economy, however defined, may be fast-growing. Does anybody know here, in a hurry, how many jobs there are in solar power in Britain? 6,000. And in renewables, 11,000. That's Office for National Statistics. Quite surprising. So when we hear for the 90th time about either the Green New Deal, the New Green Deal, the deal, you get the point. The facts are there, they're in ONS, and still people pursue them. So why are they so stupid? And I want to say that despite my aversion to, talk to my agent, please, my aversion to, acronyms and initials and things like that, I'm going to give you a few P's, if you'll allow me. And the first of those is the influence of Nancy Pelosi and the Californians. When she became Speaker in the House, she says in her recent book that energy independence for America was one of the things that made her take such an exalted position. And when we listen to Ed Miliband now, we hear that we're going to be independent of nasty regimes the more we use renewables. It doesn't seem to occur to him what Michaela rightly said, that renewables, 90% of all renewable stuff, including electric vehicle batteries, just published my article on Spike about 10 minutes ago on that, if you really need a cure for insomnia. You'll find that China is responsible for all of that. And that, the renewables do not give us energy independence any more than reliance on Saudi Arabia or people like that might do. But nevertheless, Californians have an enormous influence on the Labour Party and on media and on wokers and all of that. And that's one of the reasons why Miliband and his cohorts, all those spads at the age of 22, are so in awe of the net zero agenda. The second P is to do with a historic tradition in Britain, which you're not taking notes. I can't get my students to do it, but I'm going through all these P's, to help you do it. But never mind, we face a crisis in Western civilized virtue. Thank you. The second P is Puritanism. If you look at Just Stop Oil or Friends of the Dirt, not that for me, you'll see that frugality and literally the hair shirt philosophy, Swampy in the trees, if you're that old from way back, that has a long tradition in Britain, along with Methodism, which is more influential in the Labour Party, always has been more influential than Marxism. So the desire to show off your frugality, to beef up your Tesla as, conspicuous non-consumption, is a very big deal in British politics. And all that behaviour control stuff from Labour is all to do with the historic influence of Puritanism. The third factor in Britain is, why do people care about energy management? And that is because we're obsessed with property. Property. The bullet of British capitalism, in many ways, even more than the city, and David, maybe you'd like to contest this, but I'm sure some light will come from beneath, is, housing, estates, land, and all of that stuff. And that's the thing that, really obsesses people. And, location, and the dreadful Channel 4 couple, and all of that. That's what transfixes bourgeois society, and not energy. On the contrary, what you want is an ardour, which will, cost you 40,000 times as much energy as a normal gas cooker. And when we're talking about property, of course, we're talking about planning. It's number 4, if you're keeping up with me. My planning used to be about how do you plan new energy supply and new infrastructure. Now it's how do you stop energy supply and new infrastructure. And that's why nuclear power is so expensive in this country, because you can always call another P public inquiries about everything. And you know that to build a tunnel, you need 350,000 pages of legal documentation. So in the old days, when I was a pure, unadulterated Marxist, it used to be about the falling rate of profit. But now it's how many lawyers does it take to make a nuclear power station? That's where we've got to. How can you delay it? And so on. The fifth P is PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. That's what Miliband read at Oxford and then LSE. And, it's quite remarkable. If you go back to C.P. Snow and his famous essay, The Two Cultures, he said, artists never talk to scientists, scientists never talk to artists, but if you read him carefully and you read Frank Furedi's critique, he also said that we don't want this pure science, we want applied science. Push off Albert Einstein and all of that. We want engineers. Nowadays, they don't know who Einstein is, and they don't want the engineers either. They're dissing both theoretical science, it's just a head in the clouds. It's invention, not innovation. Lord Sainsbury said that for many years. So the PPE outlook, equips these young spads and Miliband and people like that to do devastation. The most important factors, to conclude, in messing us all up, is what Lord Frost so eloquently talked about, is what Frank Furedi calls presentism. And presentism says we've got nothing to learn from previous engineers and laws of thermodynamics and all of that. we can flout the laws of thermodynamics by saying heat pumps, produce more energy than they get fed into them. It's an absolutely brilliant overturning of science. And we're not going to prepare for the future except through mirages like energy independence. What we are going to go on about is the apocalypse, and the catastrophism that David has so rightly condemned. So just to conclude, the article on Spike, which I do commend to you, it goes into electric car batteries, because if you look at the International Energy Agency, and I'd rather not, you'll see their new report, World Energy Outlook, is absolutely gung-ho about electricity, about nuclear. They say there's a nuclear revival. There isn't, if you look at their charts, their own charts. But the reason they go so big on it is propulsion. They want to move from the internal combustion engine to lithium. By the way, Michaela, you must watch Channel 4. Know the enemy, everybody. There's a mine happening in Cornwall that everybody's very bullish about because it's going to be lithium. And why does the IEA, back all of that, and Channel 4 back all of that? Because for them, fossil fuels are the excrement of society, and that's really what critics have long said. And this says more about them and their worldview than what the prospects for electric vehicles. I don't mind EVs. I think the jury's still out on them. But a whole lot of the mortgaging of our future, according to the IEA, is towards that 7th P, propulsion. Don't buy the hype. Don't buy a Tesla until it's a lot cheaper.
James, you're not supposed to just hold the red card. It means that you're supposed to stop talking.
Sorry.
Right, Shahrar.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be on the panel. I should start with a disclaimer, which is I'm not here representing the Green Party of England and Wales as such. Apparently, they seem to think that somebody who believes in the reality of biological sex is not fit to be a national spokesperson. Now, I'm hoping if I were to ask everybody in the room whether they did believe that there are two sexes and that they're immutable, you would agree with me. But unfortunately, and I would just like to check, if I may, when I spoke at Buxton Festival 3 years ago, actually, somebody came up to me after and goes, wow, that was a hostile audience. Could you raise your hand if you consider yourself an environmentalist? Okay, good. And in the last session, actually, we had somebody distinguish what kind of environmentalist he was, and he said, I'm a non-woke environmentalist, so that's fine. Could you also raise your hand? These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive categories, but could you also raise your hand if you take yourself not to believe in anthropogenic climate change? Yeah, see, that's a fair number. So I'd just like to start. I'm going to make 3 points, essentially. One about the framing of the debate, which I think is really important. We've really had reference made to facts, opinions. How do we navigate our way through differences of opinion? Then I'll say something, I think, about tactics, the kind of political tactics which might offend you and cause greater divisiveness than I think should be necessary. And then finally, if I've got time, and if not during the Q&A, just to say a little bit about technology and what role and place that might have. So firstly, in terms of the framing of the debate, one of the first stalls I visited actually yesterday, I was somewhat assailed by this placard. Is there anybody from that stall? Yeah, no to net zero. And I had a good conversation around what they meant by that. And perhaps they thought, oh, you're an environmentalist, I better be careful, okay? No, let's not be careful. Let's be straightforward and blunt. What do you mean by that? Are you skeptical or about the very idea that we need to reduce carbon emissions? Hence why I asked you, some of you, were prepared to raise your hand and say, I don't actually think that anthropogenic climate change is real. So that's going to cause us potentially a problem. But why am I here from the Green Party talking to people who probably fundamentally disagree with me on some basic facts? I think that's what politics is about. I don't just go about speaking to people who agree with me. I actually enjoy the challenge. I relish the challenge of speaking to people who disagree with me. Why is that? The fundamental reason why is that I'm not infallible. I could be wrong. I want to have the very debate that senior Greens, just a few years ago, ruled, and they like ruling, in an authoritarian fashion. Green spokespersons shouldn't be engaging a debate with climate change deniers. Now, why is that? Is it because we're scared we might be wrong? I put it to you that that's what the sentiment is projected, that we might be wrong. Now, I've come across, including here and including previous debates, people who, of course, eloquent and passionately put the contrary view of why they don't believe in anthropogenic climate change. But we need to have that debate, and ultimately, it shows great misanthropy for Greens environmentalists to think that they go into politics to write off everybody who disagrees with me. The trouble with that is it's fundamentally authoritarian and anti-libertarian because we use the ballot box. So one of the greatest fears that comes from this approach is that if politicians are unprepared to speak to me simply because they disagree with me, what would they be prepared to do when they're in power? Will they just ignore my wishes? Would they ignore what it is that I want or what it is that I say is most important? And I don't think, and even within our constitution, parliamentarians are supposed to serve everybody, irrespective of whether or not they voted for them. So that is a problem in terms of political framing. There will be individuals here who are going to say to me, contrary to what I think is the case, like IPCC reports, I'll take one authority figure, I'll take one scientist, and you'll take another one and say, well, no, that's not how it is, that's not how I see things. We desperately need to have a view, a challenging debate about those facts. I think there's a reality about the situation in terms of carbon emissions have gone up. They're the highest that they've ever been. In the last session, somebody was saying carbon is a necessity, right? It's not a pollutant. Well, again, that's framing the situation wrongly. It's a pollutant insofar as it's a greenhouse gas. We're not saying that it isn't a necessary part of the fabric of the air that we breathe. That's a separate question. So just in terms of the framing of the debate, it's vital that we speak to people who disagree with us because the alternative is authoritarianism. I'm against authoritarianism. I don't want, it's all about means and ends. I do want to live in a sustainable fashion. I do believe that the planet we are living beyond our means with potentially 10% of the richest expending 50% of the carbon pollution. I do think that's an inequitable situation that needs to be changed. There is pollution happen anyway in terms of the oceans are becoming increasingly uninhabitable for all the creatures that live there. Species extinction is on an all-time high. These are matters we might be able to agree upon, even if we don't agree upon the reasons for them. So that's another basis to work out the things on which we can agree and to decide, for example, I don't want to live in a planet where the oceans are uninhabitable for whatever reason. So in addition to the climate so-called existential emergency or not, we are also facing an environmentalist calamity in terms of just pollution effects of us living beyond our means. So we can agree about certain things, and then what is the solution? How do we propose to move forward after that? Well, I'm not proposing that, if you were to say, I don't buy into net zero, and therefore I'm not going to comply with your policy to change how I live, I'm not going to fit insulation, even if you subsidise for me. I'm not going to accept your offer of a smart meter. You could say all those things, and the issue, my response isn't going to be like throwing canned tomato soup, right, at Van Gogh, or frustrating your attempt to get to work because I'm sitting on top of a train in Canning Town, right? I think these are very poor tactics because they alienate the very people who may disagree with you, and they're not going to come on board simply because you're frustrating them in going about their daily lives. So finally, in terms of technology, there was an interesting panel around the rights and wrongs of nuclear power, and we can have that discussion again, in terms of is that part of the options for change. I think what I should say at a stroke is that I'm not a technophobe. I do think one of the commonalities between those who disagree fundamentally on the climate science, I think on all sides there is a degree of optimism. Those who perhaps say it's not an emergency but it is a serious problem, their optimism suggests to them they have a faith in human ingenuity, if you like. They think that we'll be able to fix it. Now, I actually think they've got a point. I do believe that, I do to some extent, believe in moral progress. I do think societies have been able to overcome, using engineering solutions, ways in which we can fix problems. I do think we've got a rock and a hard place now, territory at the moment, because I don't think we can realistically maintain our living standards, which I grant are good and worth having, as other side of the world would attest. I do think that that's a difficult proposition to sustain whilst carrying on business as usual. So that's essentially what this is about. This is about, can we carry on business as usual using technological solutions to fix this, or do we actually have to abate our lifestyle? And what does that look like? Could it actually be a better form of life, a more community form of life with decentralized, decarbonized energy? Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Now we're starting to get to the meat of this, because I was thinking to those people who say, well, let's just take a few ground rules here. Let's just imagine that climate change is a serious problem. Not imagine, you know what I mean? Let's just take it for granted, for this purposes of this debate, that climate change is a problem. We can disagree about how big a problem it is. What are we going to do about it? So for the people who are perhaps critics of current policy, well, what would we do about it? And I think Shahrar put it quite pointedly there at the end of his introduction. How big a price are we willing to pay if we think that, to pursue net zero policies, for example? So, we've got these competing things going on. That's something I want to try and really dig into during this debate. But anyway, the floor is now yours, ladies and gentlemen. So can I get some hands? So I'll take one of the microphones. How many microphones have we got? Oh, there's one up there. Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got 3 quick questions for the panel. UK power security, hugely important to this country. How do you ensure that happens? How do we reduce the cost of electricity, or power rather, that affects every sector of our society? And then finally, the somewhat controversial Climate Change Committee. Who holds them to account?
Lord Frosty made some very strong points about how one would make the case against net zero at the end there. But I think obviously one of the points you stressed in your piece in your speech was about markets, and the fact that, as we all know, the renewables industry has been heavily subsidized for a long time. And this isn't something that's grown organically. And in fact, one thing that wasn't in that list was the influence of the green blob, as it's called, and sort of the lobbying that is involved there. And to just pivot briefly to what James said at the start, which was perhaps it was a Freudian slip, but you talked about David Miliband and not just Ed Miliband. But just one part of that green blob that came to light recently was the fact that David Miliband is advising a sort of green technology investment company, which has benefited from policies that Ed Miliband has brought in. So how important is it to expose the sort of lobbying element of the green industry in order to make the case against
Just pass it forward there, please. Just pass it forward.
In terms of the party politics on this question, I noted with interest on Friday that the Shadow Energy Secretary broke the religion and denounced the long-term burning of wood at the Drax Power Station, which burns about 27 million trees a year, and said that's no longer part of the Tories' long-term solution. Does the panel think that there's going to be more political divide over how decarbonisation takes place?
Okay, and could you just pass it to the person next to you? Thank you.
Just want to pick up on the gentleman from the Greens. Sorry. It's possible to believe that climate change is happening, and it might be a bit of a problem, but also to believe that net zero is the wrong approach to deal with it. So broadly speaking, what you're advocating is what's known as the mitigation strategy. So if somehow we build loads of windmills, then the weather will get better. Whereas an alternative approach would be an adaptation strategy, which has the effect of working regardless of what everyone else does. So mitigation relies upon 2 things. One is that carbon dioxide is the only climate control knob, which it clearly isn't. And 2, everyone else adopting the mitigation strategy. And clearly that's not true either, because as you said yourself, CO2 emissions are continuing to rise. So the strategy which we are adopting is essentially one of unilateral impoverishment that's making no difference to the world at all. And I would argue essentially the net zero cure is worse than the alleged climate change disease.
That's David Turver, by the way. You should follow his Substack. It's very, very good. Now, there's somebody up in the balcony. And then I'll bring the panel back in for their first thoughts.
Shahrar, I can't be a green anymore. I accept that carbon dioxide is increasing in the atmosphere. I accept that humans have caused it. I also accept that here in the UK we have a special obligation as one of the world's richest countries to do something to put it right, to lead by example. But our party's view is somewhat more than that. It is net zero. And let me give you a concrete example of net zero as it's going to actually happen. In my district in the South Pennines, there is a beautiful moorland called Walshaw Moor, where a Saudi Arabian investment firm plans to put about 50 absolutely huge wind turbines. Walshaw Moor, if you don't know, is beside Haworth, and it is beside Top Withens Farm, the inspiration for Bronte's Wuthering Heights. It is a beautiful and supremely lonely location, which will be, in my view, desecrated. There are other things than carbon reduction, even if it's going to be produced at the cost of the Saudi Arabians rather than the local community. That electricity may be cheap, but it certainly won't be free. And for that reason, I have to reject the Green Party's advocacy of net zero and its refusal simultaneously to discuss it, with your honourable exception. And for that reason, and a few other reasons which I'm sure you can imagine, to do with authoritarianism, the Green Party is no longer a party I can support.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, panel, I'm going to bring you in to give us your first responses. I'll just go on from left to right as I'm looking. So, Michaela, just your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I can't remember all the questions, but just generally, what I'm struck by is that we're all sat around in this room and around our kitchen tables at home trying to figure out the energy policy of the UK. And, you know, you would have hoped that that was somebody's job. And I reckon that I think that if people are professionally doing that, they should be managing it well. So, first of all, the fact that we're all here and trying to figure it out together is really a problem for me. So I think that it just highlights the fact that the policymakers have not been doing their job. And this is a really important policy. Energy policy is critical to the success of this country, not just on a personal level for all our households, but also for industry and globally as well. I think it's a massive opportunity, and we can turn our back on it. That's not a problem, because it will go on anyway. So I don't think that whether the UK is in on green technologies, it doesn't really count, but it will affect everyone in this room and the younger generations. I genuinely believe that. So that's what I'm arguing for at this point. Around belief, I'm not involved in belief. I used to cross off the word. I used to write it on the board and cross it out. I said, I don't want anybody to believe things that are like fairies and things. I actually want people to look at facts and then analyse those facts, and then we work out together how we manage those facts. And that's what I'm looking for here. There's a couple of other things around burning wood in power stations. Absolutely ridiculous. Who on earth has come up with that? Putting wind turbines in beautiful places, ridiculous. But those things are not a consequence of renewable energy. That's not. It's just poor management of renewable energy, and we've got to remember that. Thank you.
Okay. David. We're just picking up a couple of points. The question on kind of markets and lobbying and the green blob and all of that. I mean, I think the problem is we've created such a complicated system in this country for energy that literally nobody really understands how it works. There are so many targets and cross subsidies and price support mechanisms and so on and so forth. Literally nobody can actually understand it, I think. So your point, Michaela, about what is the British energy policy, in a way, is a good question. I think nobody can really understand it, and we've created, therefore, an environment which is extremely ripe for lobbying. Everybody can get in on this and try and make their view prevail. And this is obviously a terrible way of going about it. If you set aside what we think about net zero, what we think about climate, it's still better to do it in a market-based way and, put a price on carbon and then let the market sort out how to do it. But the problem with that is it shows how expensive it is. And the advantage of all these cross-subsidies and sort of regulatory capture and so on and so forth is it disguises all the costs of this system, and carbon tax makes it brutally clear, and that's why governments always recoil from it. But it would still be a better way, I think. Just a couple of other points quickly. The Climate Change Committee, how do we hold it to account? It's a very good question. I don't think anybody can. I'm on the Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee, and they appear as before from time to time. I don't think they think they're accountable to us, that's for sure, and probably not others in Parliament. I think this whole creation of kind of legislation to create people to bind the government in some way, there's been such a thing over the last 20 years. The effect of that is to create kind of quasi-constitutional legislation with a sort of superior status. Otherwise, why have it at all? It must be thought to be different in some way. And so we've got these laws, and the Climate Change Act is one of them, where you can't... it becomes very difficult to question it. It becomes part of the wiring of the state rather than the kind of policy of the state. And we've got more and more areas where that's happening. So that is a big problem. And again, I just wouldn't go about it in this way. Much more to say, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Shahrar.
Just firstly, a quick but necessary digression into epistemology. So Michaela's rightly questioning language in terms of how we use belief and her interest in fact. I sometimes face a problem, actually, when I say I believe in something and somebody says, well, you've just asserted as fact. I said, well, that's because I'm convincing, right? But if I were to say to you, well, you believe that, it's probably because I'm just being polite, because I think you're absolutely wrong. Here are some facts, then, just to pursue this point, because it's quite important. The Earth's climate is warming. A warming climate is dangerous. We're causing the warming by emitting CO2 from burning fossil fuels. Therefore, we need to prevent dangerous climate change by eliminating CO2 emissions, right, or reducing them. Now, I regard that as a reasonable argument and based on facts. But this comes from a publication published by the Global Warming Policy Foundation, Professor Judith Curry, and she's presenting those as contentious, so-called climate certainties. So there we have a series of what I take to be facts that somebody is then opinionating upon and not accepting. So the bottom line is, as Popper and others have understood in terms of confirmation bias, we're not going to get very far by just saying we want to agree or dispute facts. Facts are going to be contestable depending on your point of view. So that's going to be a problem. The question around power, energy security and expense. We have to bite the bullet, I think, around the failures of our economic system. We're still talking as if we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. The issue with those climate change, those who are raising the alarm, is that they believe we're facing human extinction. Now, it may be hard to put a figure on that. You could say that we've reached the point of no return, it's irreversible by 2030, and therefore we need a net zero target to take account of that, okay? Or there's a lag in the system, whatever we do now. I was at a meeting, chairing a meeting with the then Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, about 20 years ago now, and he was asked about climate emergency, and he took himself to be quite well informed, and he said, it's too late. it's already too late because of the lag in the system, but also, crucially, because of his understanding of human nature. And I think that is another issue we need to grapple with. If people aren't going to come on board, then we're going to collectively go extinct, right? Now, you could be an optimist, but at some point, optimism is going to have to face up to the reality that we're living beyond our means and we cannot go on like this indefinitely. And we are leaving a completely inhospitable legacy for future generations. So the answer then to this fixation on economic growth is to remodel that. And we've got plenty of good examples of this. We can think about, I know we've left the EU, but we had the EU emissions trading scheme, which was attempting to trade in carbon. Now, we often use cashless currency exchanges. All we're doing there, so we've got a notion of what it means, right? Not to trade or have a different currency. It would be quite easy, I think, to switch from pound sterling to something that was pegged to the actual cost, shall I say, to the environment of what it is that we're doing. When we buy into government subsidized schemes that would allow us to scrap our car in order to get a more efficient vehicle, what we're not doing most of the time is factoring in the true cost of dumping something on the planet. So, a proper carbon currency model, which could be rolled out quite quickly. And interestingly enough, David Miliband was one of the first advocates around about 2000. And he wasn't Environment Secretary for very long. And I think that he was rattling a few cages at that point. So we do have solutions, sometimes coming out of universities, which again, you may not trust. But we have policy solutions which are attempting not just to recalibrate, but to have a complete overhaul of our convention, after all, pound sterling, call it what you want, through transition town movements, they're using their own currencies as well. So we have an idea. Can we develop that idea so that we are building into individual transactions in an egalitarian way? Here's your carbon budget for the year. Can you please stick to that? That would be, a proposed solution.
Okay, James.
Well, the first question was about how do we get power or energy security? I would say after a great but flawed introduction by a fellow Dutchman yesterday on nuclear power that we should pour some serious R&D money into nuclear fusion. That would provide energy security. If I hear the joke about it's been promised for 30 years another time, I'll tell you the joke has been going for 30 years. So I'm a bit fed up with that. And it indicates a fundamental misanthropic feeling about what ingenuity can do. So let's hear it for fusion. What to do about holding the Climate Change Committee to account? Abolish the CCC. Just going back to the first point, because it comes on to the point that was made about lobbying and David Miliband rather eloquently there. In general, I'm against the Guardian, Private Eye, boring, join the dots approach to problems. I think ideas, opinions, if Michaela will allow me, the clash of views, as you've heard so eloquently here, is much more important than follow the money. By the way, follow the money is a phrase used by Deep Throat in the crap movie All the President's Men. So I'm not going to follow that method, I'll tell you that. So it just doesn't do it. It's conspiracy theory on wheels. Having said that, I'm surprised that the Honourable Lord says that we should first, put a price on carbon, then let the market decide. And that seems to me a bit of a contradiction, right? One is interventionist, the other is our old friend free markets. If you look at what was just mentioned, the emissions trading system in the EU, you'll find that it's utterly corrupt. It goes up and down. It's a complete shenanigan. And the amount of grift going on, you're right about David Miliband, the amount of grift going on with carbon credits, carbon offsets. I'm bound to say it's going to happen with carbon currencies and carbon budgets, right? I mean, I believe in human nature, but it's foolish to imagine that criminals will not fasten on all of this stuff, just as they are on shops and all the rest of it. Will there be more parliamentary division about things, abortions like Drax? I suspect not, with the amiable exception of Lord Frost. I think maybe he can talk about this. The experience of the European Research Group during Brexit shows that they do not, the right of the Tory party, do not have a spine. They will not be opposing Drax anytime soon, and Carrie Johnson is going to carry the day, carry the can, you name it, she's going to do it. So I don't think we can look forward to that being fixed. As usual, David Turver, and for the Twitters among us, 7 Kiwi. It's a lot easier than spelling my name, right? 7 Kiwi. This is David Turver looking faintly relaxed there. He's so right to talk about adaptation and mitigation. We need flood defences better than sandbags, up north and all round Britain, with or without climate change. At the moment we got sandbags. The Scandinavians have it all done in plastic, and it really works to, stop the collapse of small businesses throughout England and Scotland by having, 21st century or 20th century will do plastics. Could be Bakelite as far as I'm concerned, but not sand. So can we get a bit hip to mitigation, please, and pay more attention to David Turver. Now, I have to say another word, since I love disagreeing with everybody, is that our Green friend, ex-Green Party friend at the top, made some very good points. But one where I can't agree is him saying that, we have a historic responsibility, presumably because we, brought about the Industrial Revolution. We are a special case, and therefore we've got to set an example to the world about adaptation, more particularly mitigation. Have you ever heard of the idea of Britain setting an example to the world? They're really watching that in Beijing right now. And in Delhi they're reading the Daily Mail and a conservative woman to find out what to do next. It's what I always call limp jingoism. They can't get it up, but if you'll excuse the phrase, but they got to go by jingo. We're setting an example. What it means is Ed gets to go to COP28 and laud it. It doesn't matter he's irrational and a prat. He feels good about himself. This is psychobabble on wheels, and it just won't do.
Okay. That's winding things up nicely. So I'm going to come forward from the back. So there's the woman just there beside you. Yeah, we'll just keep coming forward now. We're going to have lots of comments from the floor.
Yes, I'm just trying to formulate the question.
Just stand up.
What I'm getting is that we need to get past the impasse and focus on things that you might have in common. And what I'm getting is that we really need to achieve a consensus that net zero is insane. And if you start talking to architects and installers and engineers on the ground, they're saying, the maths don't add up. So for those of us who are environmentalists and understand climate change is real and a threat, but that net zero is bonkers, we feel like the squeezed middle, and maybe we can kind of explore that, and also explore that electrification of everything has its problems as well, and that low-level radiation and smart meters has its problems. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So what I'm getting is inching towards a consensus, because this impasse is really costing us as a country, and maybe we could do that by working out ways to depoliticize this debate and come together on the stuff that will matter. One of which may be planting more trees and focusing on biodiversity and just looking at the real cost and benefits. But I appreciate these debates, and I don't know what my question is.
Okay, comments are fine. No, just keep passing it forward. Yeah.
In a local sense, it seems bizarre that we focus purely on territorial emissions and not consumption emissions. The fact that we can get a plus in our accounts by buying dirty steel from China rather than working out how to make the world's cleanest steel in Sheffield seems to lead to a whole range of stupid policy. And in a global sense, there's 2 billion people in the world still cook on open fires. If we spent a tiny fraction of the money we're spending on net zero in this country, getting people off open fires and onto solar ovens or onto even natural gas, you would do much more to prevent climate change than anything we're doing here.
Okay, thank you. Now, just go sideways.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, very interesting. On the green jobs thing, I thought as it's a battle of ideas, maybe you can all mention one green job, even if you're against the environmental issue. I thought the 11,000 figure was erroneous because green tech involves Elon Musk's Tesla. He's a billionaire off green tech. On solar fields, did you know that sheep can actually live under the solar panels in the field? My lord, you're supposed to be right-wing. Your party put red tape and bureaucracy in front of people building wind turbines. That's not free market. That's not right-wing. So nothing personal, but I think if you believe in a right-wing party and a genuine free market, we should be allowing people to build solar panels and wind turbines. And who cares about a few cables from a village view? Do you believe in the free market or not? Let's have more cables. On the issue of nuclear, do you believe that we should be training more people in nuclear energy if that's part of the green future by subsidised university degrees? And again, the right wing of the Conservative Party, why would you be in favour of gas? You're funding Putin. Why would you be in favour of fossil fuels and oil when that's funding Wahhabi Islam and that's implementation in the UK? It's not right wing to be in favour of fossil fuels, in my opinion. And lastly, on the issue of storage, with your hydrogen company, could we have 100% renewable energy and store all of it with hydrogen and then burning the hydrogen to create that fuel? Or in every home having a Tesla Powerwall. Is that possible? I think it might be. Thank you.
Okay, now further forward, just on the other side of the aisle. I don't know about politically, but, yes. Stand up, please.
Okay. Right. Environmentalism really is a religion, isn't it? I was brought up as a Catholic, and I always used to smile. My mother used to light candles, but now we've got the environmentalists. I hate it when they're always saying, plant more trees, that'll solve it. Well, London's already a forest. The UN definition of a forest is 20% tree coverage, and London comes in at 21%. Up to 80% of photosynthesis occurs in the oceans. Climate mitigation is not going to happen by planting more trees. There are rainforests on every continent on the earth except for Antarctica. But we only ever hear about the Amazon. So can we please stop saying this religious mantra of plant more trees?
Okay, could you pass that forward? Yes, just keep grabbing, that's fine.
Hi, Jack Ball. I just wanted to ask a question because I think that by the way, I think a lot of what's been said about the environment is very important, and I do think it's a man-made issue, and I do think we have to tackle it. But I'll tell you what annoys me. The solutions that we propose are so city and London-centric, and they never think about rural communities where I work, like down in rural East Devon. They never think about how things work for people that do not have easy public transport access, infrastructure to fund some of the funding to sort some of the projects. The best example, and it was mentioned by somebody earlier, is electric vehicles. Now, I'm all for electric vehicles if people want to buy them, but there's a couple of things you need. They need to be affordable, and they're not for ordinary working people at the moment. You need to build more chargers, and you haven't built them across the East Devon countryside. And you need to actually build cars that can go far enough so you don't get stranded in the middle of a long B road with loads of potholes like you do in rural Britain. But the people that are making this policy are never from rural communities. They're always the London establishment, and they just don't get it. Thank you.
Okay.
Forward. Sorry, Richard Wolf. Energy for industry. What industry? As the panel booth. What industry? We don't make steel, we don't make glass, we don't make textiles, we don't make ceramics anymore. Does the panel believe? No, we don't. We don't in the way we did. 10% of our GDP is on industry. The use of
Could you hold it closer to your mouth a little bit?
Sorry. Okay, sorry. So energy for industry, but what industry? Does the panel believe that Britain no longer wants industry, doesn't understand industry, and has done nothing to stop its decline? And is this society of speculators the future for the UK?
Okay.
All right, thank you. A very interesting talk. I just really don't like this emotive language that's being used again, disasters, emergency. I listened to Sir Jim Kerr, who's the head of the IPC now in Guildhall at the Climate Innovation Forum. He didn't mention emergency once or disaster once. He said the climate changes, it does, and we need to adapt and innovate to meet those challenges. And it was a very clear message, and I was really encouraged by it. Then we had John Kerry stand up, and every other word, disaster, Bangladesh, rain, flood, disaster, emergency. You know, why are we using this emotive language all the time? It's just, you know, it does change. Climate changes. We need to meet that with innovation, and we can do it.
Could you pass across the aisle again, please?
Thank you. Tony Glover. I'm afraid my question may be more slightly directed at David. The two remaining leadership candidates for the Conservative Party, one's proposed getting rid of the Climate Change Act, and the other one has gone on about net zero. Bearing in mind that the Climate Change Act was delivered by a deal between David Miliband and Oliver Letwin at the time, given that net zero was invented by the Conservative Party and passed by Conservative MPs, forgive me for being a bit sceptical that they're actually going to do what they say. Do you believe they are going to do what they say, or are we just going to have more and more of carry and a lot less of good sense from the Conservatives?
Right, could you ask you to pass it forwards to the front now, please? There's two at the front, and then I'm going to give the panel like a minute each just to throw some points back.
I'm assuming. Do you want me to stand up? Okay. I've got some facts for everyone, some questions. I'd like to, first, Michaela, how much energy do you need to get the equivalent energy out of hydrogen, and how do you transport it? And what proportion of the hydrogen in the UK at the moment is what they call green hydrogen, or is most of it black, brown, and maybe blue? But I don't even think we got that. David, you probably are aware, like the man's just said, that the £11.4 billion that Ed Miliband is taking the credit for giving to developing nations was already written into an article written by the Tories, a consultation on our CBAM. So how come the Conservatives had already written about the £11.4 billion before the Labor Party even got in? Was the Conservatives planning to do it as well? I think they were. Another question for our ex-Green member is, why do you think a warmer world will be a more dangerous world? Could you just explain that to me? There is a larger increase between the temperature when you wake up in the morning and the temperature at lunchtime than 1.5 degrees. I was born in a country that's about 10 degrees on average hotter than this one, and everyone's still alive there. They'll all be fine. And I'd love to ask you a question, James, but you know everything, so I won't. I will explain to someone at the back and someone over there. We still make glass, we still make ceramics. We're putting a CBAM on it to protect us from the Chinese. And one of our big exports is crude oil, which we're closing down, which is really dumb because it's a big part of our balance of trade.
So I just opened with a fact. Yeah, sorry. I'm right in front of the camera, but that's okay. So in 2020, our global energy mix, it was 16% renewable. Of that 16%, 11% was wood. So one of the reasons we burnt wood was to artificially inflate the renewable stats. And if you look at solar and wind was 1%, solar was 0.8. So if you only did those, and that's 2020, I couldn't tell you what it is now. I'm anti-net zero, but I'm going to make an argument in favour of net zero. I'm anti-French, but I'm going to make an argument in favour of France. And that is, there's only one country that's achieved net zero already. It already did it. The French did it. They realised it was incredibly expensive to build a nuclear power station, to build one. And what did the British do? Every now and again we build one. What did the French do? They realised it was really, really cheap if you built lots of nuclear power stations. And that's why they had 80% nuclear energy and they've come closer to achieving net zero than any other country ever has or ever will unless they pursue the same strategy. Now, of course, it's down to 70% because they've stopped pursuing this good policy and they're getting away from net zero. And I say that as someone who agrees with all of you that net zero is a bunch of junk, as is the climate crisis, which has always been delayed, like the population crisis. And now they've learnt their lesson and they've put it at this indeterminate time after we're all dead. That's when the tipping point's going to be. Because it can't be in 2024 anymore or 2023 because Greta has to delete her tweet saying it was.
Okay. Right. So panel, I really want you to just respond to one point. I will give you a couple of minutes at the end, but if you could just respond to like one point that's annoying you. So, James, 1 point.
Well, the point was well made at the front that, people quite like higher temperatures, except if you're in Bangladesh or somewhere really very, very hot. Let me tell you, as a forecaster, the issue that's coming down the pike that's already exercising the International Energy BS agency is air conditioning. The warmer we get, and I'm with David Turver here, 7 Kiwi once again, who introduced me to the phrase lukewarmer. It's got nothing to do. It's got nothing to do with Star Trek. The other one, Star Wars. But it is possible, as somebody referring to the squeezed middle said, to believe in anthropogenic climate change, but not to see mitigation and the hair shirt philosophy as the way to deal with it, but rather ingenuity and so on. So the IEA is worried about air conditioning. As we get warmer through global warming, then we're going to need more air conditioning. But there's a problem because it emits a lot of carbon because of electricity and so on. So I just the point to add.
No, 1 point. So Shahrar.
Okay.
Yes, go.
He's the boss.
Itching to do it. Maybe you should have some of my time. Okay, right. I will pick up on some points at the end as well. But the one that I really wanted to address was the point about language and rhetoric and alarmism, if you like, which certainly I would suggest different strokes for different folks. I do think there is a place, if it's responsible, for alarming language. Doesn't make it alarmist if it's true. Going back to our old friend, Judith Curry, in the Global Warming Policy Foundation, propaganda is actually a very good source of information. She's done the research for me. So here are some quotes which she describes as fueling apocalyptic rhetoric from the UN and our national leaders. The clock is ticking towards climate catastrophe. Okay, that's fairly alarmist. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. Business as usual, right? The UN Paris Agreement targets net zero emissions by 2050 to keep warming to within 1.5 degrees. There is an issue here around motivation and demotivation, and we've got to be responsible about that. We've got to bear in mind who we're speaking to and ensure that, I think, people describe this language as defeatist. And so if there's one necessary thing that we need to engender in politics, it's the idea that we can change, even if there's a narrowing window of opportunity for us to actually turn things around.
Okay, David.
Well, just the 2 or 3 comments made about the Conservative Party. I mean, I don't feel particularly comfortable defending the Conservative Party, to be honest. And to give myself credit, I did have to resign from the government in protest against many of the sort of things we've discussing. So that's what makes me a bit uncomfortable about it. So, but I do think that both leadership candidates in their different ways. I support Rob, but I think both of them in their different ways have moved towards looking again at net zero and the Climate Change Act and all of that. And I'll say what I will do is try and make sure that happens. I mean, obviously the Conservative Party has a credibility problem over the last few years, but we've got to start rebuilding, and I feel I do what I can to do that. I think the Conservative Party does take responsibility. The point about us being responsible for wind farms or the 11 billion of climate aid and all of that. I'm in favour of building things where we need to. The problem is that we have a system which hides all the costs, relies on subsidy, and means that things get built, whether they're cables, wind farms, whatever, that ought not to be built in a rational world. And that's why I'm opposed them. If we had a proper market-based system with costs falling where they should and total clarity about it, then nobody would be wanting to build onshore wind farms in the first place. I'm convinced of that, so the problem wouldn't arise.
Okay, Michaela, I'm kind of curious to know what the answer is to that hydrogen question as well, and since you're the hydrogen person...
Yeah. Yes, certainly. So there's a couple of hydrogen questions. So yes, hydrogen does solve the intermittency of renewables. That's one of the ways of storing the energy that you generate through renewables. And the nice thing is that somebody else calculates the cost. It's total cost of ownership, and you've got to calculate that for every place. You can't just say, what's the cost? It's just not that easy. It's different in different locations. But it does have relevance, and it's part of hydrogen will be part of the energy portfolio going forwards. I don't think anybody in energy disputes that. The question is, what percentage of the energy portfolio will it generate? And that will depend on what we go for in terms of the electricity generation. So we might go for nuclear to some degree, we might go for renewables to some degree, and we will stick with hydrocarbons, I believe, for a while longer. What we need to do is it's not about the carbon in the atmosphere and burning wood and all of this is releasing carbon. It's about the balance of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's the injection of fossil carbon into the atmosphere, which is the artificial inflation of carbon in the atmosphere, which increases carbon, not carbon itself. So there's fundamentally nothing wrong with carbon. So it's all about fossil carbon and it accelerating at a rate that we can't control and we don't like the consequences of. So hydrogen will be used. It's going to be differently costed in different places. Sorry, can I just finish one point? Thank you. But the point here is that hydrogen it also is exactly as this chap at the front said. It's about economies of scale. Costs are very different. If you build one, if you build 1 million, the costs are entirely different. And what it actually does is pull on supply chains. And a few people have mentioned in the room, what are people going to actually do? And what are we going to make? What are we going to build? Do we even want to participate in this area? Well, if we want a car industry in this country, then we actually have to produce the generation technologies that power and propel those vehicles. It's the same with the aerospace industry. It's the same with the maritime industry. So these things are not just about renewables. They're about the fundamental industries that this country relies upon. And by the way, that also affects the London Stock Exchange Group. They are concerned about the failure of us to commercialise these technologies we invent, because that actually undermines the economic foundation of this country, and that's why it's not just about renewables.
Right, okay. So I want to give the panel like a couple of minutes at the end, so we're going to have to whiz round. So there's some hands at the front, people who haven't spoken before.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we'll start there, quick points.
If I'm honest, I think it's a hoax, the whole idea of anthropomorphic global warming. However, it's pretty apparent from the level of carbon that's currently in the atmosphere, I think it's about 400 parts per million, is one of the lowest it's been since the records have been taken and from the scientific examination of the past over the last few million years. Where I have a problem is no one actually tells us what the ideal level of carbon is in the atmosphere. And if that's the case, how do we know when we've got there? And more importantly, who's actually going to tell us that we've got there? Because I sort of think that we're never going to get there, and it will just be a continual theft of our resources to those who are telling us we've got an existential problem.
Okay, right. Directly in front of you. We'll just kind of whiz through a few
A couple of the speakers have referenced unease around the word belief. I was at a lecture by the Bayesian Society recently, and they gave a definition or an alternate description of the word belief, and they said belief is prediction. And I think that's a useful way to phrase it and to think of it, because it forces you to get away from a lot of the fuzzy thinking. Do you believe in climate change? No. Are you predicting that these things are going to happen? So,
Okay, thank you. Can we bring it? Yeah, just go across. Yep, that's fine. Yep.
Just in terms of carbon dioxide, it's about 400 parts per million, and 150 years ago it was about 300 parts per million. If it gets to as low as 150 parts per million, we'll all die. That's the end of plant life. So the idea of taking it out of the atmosphere is actually potentially quite dangerous. Over a long period of time, it's at a relatively low level. The idea that we're going to get to 1,000 parts per million is that's actually not going to happen. But even if it did, there's no suggestion that would be dangerous.
Okay.
Ellery?
And then we're going to quickly whiz over here. Right, come on. Oh, right, okay.
Michelle Shipworth, UCL Energy Institute. Question for both David and Shahrar. What might a low carbon, not a net zero, what might a low carbon good life look like?
Thank you. Good question. Right. So, yes.
Okay. One for James. Fusion, which is possibly the holy grail of the world's energy source in the future. How far off are we, do you think?
Okay. Right, yes. Two here, and then we'll go to...
I'm not sure if the panel is aware of the Envisat satellite that took measurements of CO2 above landmass about 15 years ago. Yes, there is a variation between 350 parts per million and 400 parts per million. The interesting thing is that the 400 parts per million is exclusively above the rainforests. And the level of 375 is the same above the Australian Central Desert and above northwestern Europe. The rainforests are also responsible for emitting a lot of methane, another greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas, and water vapor, another greenhouse gas. So if you really want to set about greenhouse gases, get out the chainsaw.
And just two quickies behind you there. They have to be really quick.
Howard Thompson, Chair, Conservative Policy Forum in Surrey Heath. Copenhagen Atomics, they reckon they can build on a production line basis a standard container size 100 megawatt molten salt nuclear reactor that they can deliver 20 pounds per megawatt hour within the next 5 to 10 years. That could be a game changer. They reckon they've done all, it's work in progress. They haven't shipped a production model, but they reckon to do that, experimental version within a couple of years. Carbon dioxide. There's a book by Jeremy Nieboer, Nieboer, that looks at the ice records going back the last 200,000 years. CO2 has changed as a result of changes in climate temperature, not the other way around for thousands of years, geologic time. We really fail to understand what's going on.
Right, okay, right. The very last point.
Okay.
No pressure.
Hi, thanks. Andrew Lound. Listening to you all, I thought it was really fascinating, and an interesting quoting of a film was quite good. I'd like to quote from the film, Nigel Neal film, Quatermass. And I feel that Dr. Kendall here is a little bit like Quatermass when they ask the question, supposing there's a global disaster happening to the planet, what do you think will happen, Dr. Quatermass? And what does he say? Well, all the policymakers will sit around and talk themselves into nothing while the scientists try and do something about it. I think what we need to send is studs up out here. We need more scientists and the technicians actually as part of the policy-making system rather than just sitting there and waiting to be told.
Right, okay, now, one quick announcement. Paul Morland's, whose book No One Left was discussed earlier in the day, he's signing books at the bookshop. And in fact, just go and look at the bookshop. It's full of great stuff. Right, I'm going to go in the reverse order of where we started. So, Shahrar, you can get your retaliation in first. Over to you. 2 minutes, max.
Okay, let's just pick up on some earlier points. And then there was one that was specifically addressed to me. In terms of the self-stultifying nature in which net zero is defined. Somebody made an excellent point earlier around territorial emissions, if you like, which are biased against truth, effectively, because if we're essentially exporting our carbon emissions to faraway lands, it might make us feel better when we're importing crapula from China for Christmas, but we're not actually doing the planet any better. So we do need a joined-up international approach that takes proper account of carbon emissions, if that is a reasonable project in the first place, and I gather some of you don't think it is. I don't think it's a good idea to take a chainsaw to the rainforest, by the way, and I'm wondering where you got that information from, and maybe there are some flaws in the way the data is presented, but the data wouldn't actually be advocating that. It's a joke. I don't believe in jokes. I'm an environmentalist. Thank you. So another, we haven't got long. So in terms of not in my backyard, a greater worry, of course, is that we implement infrastructure solutions which do not help all those in rural areas as well, because we're myopic about their situation. The way around this is. And I think this is a good idea that we're discussing here, of course, as I've said before. But this is effectively like, and it may be without the focus group, comparators, whatever. But this is like a citizenship assembly. And the Green Party, last time I checked, were advocating those type of fora. Why? It's in order to make sure that the needs of the local communities are met. And in order to do that, you need to consult them and address them and make sure that they're done. So finally, there was a question put to me about what might a low carbon society look like. So we've got, there's a mnemonic around, reduce, recycle, repurpose, reuse, if you like. So we will be consuming less, that's for sure. But I would put it to you that in a society in which there's greater resilience, greater decentralization of the energy needs, and you've got more power over how you actually generate power locally, you will be more resilient, and there'll be greater community. There will be a much better sense of you'll be overcoming some of the mental health, frankly, problems that the current economic system actually encourages and engenders, because it's not the case that you need to fuel the insatiable appetite for more and more.
Okay, thank you. James?
Well, I thought I might have been pushing a point with Puritanism, but one of my P's. But when I heard about dirty steel in China, I was reminded that cleanliness is next to godliness. And, we've got to stop using the categories dirty and clean. Right? They're moral categories, they're religious categories, they've got no scientific basis. If you think a wind turbine is produced purely by clean means, and that all the metal and steel and all the electronics and all the foundations are, carbon free, then, as Sam Goldwyn said, anybody who sees a psychiatrist needs his head examined. So that's one thing. What's a low carbon world like? Well, if you go beneath 18%, which is what we're made of, it's free of humans. Some Greens want that. But it's also free of plastics, so no preservation of food, no cars of any sort, including electric cars, no pharmaceuticals. They are made through carbon-generating processes and so on. So I'll take the full measure of carbon myself rather than the low-carbon scenario. Hydrogen part of the portfolio, as Michaela says, yes. The one thing I agree about with the International Energy Agency is that it's a very, very, very small part of that portfolio. And I think they're very convincing about that. How long for fusion? Well, it's nice to ask a forecaster that. My reply is, how long is a piece of string? Because it all depends what kind of funding for what kind of R&D pursued at what quality will make the difference. Myself, if you look at what's happening in fusion around the world, without a world war, we're probably going to see the first demonstration plants in 15 years. That's a big advance on the old-fashioned 30. Finally, does Britain want industry? Well, the ruling class doesn't want it much. They prefer property. But there is a textile industry in this country. I mean, otherwise, why do we get all the protests about fast fashion and its terrible effect on the environment? Shine, the Chinese ones, but also Boohoo and Boo.com or Boo somebody. And, if we didn't have a textile industry, how would we have the modern Labour leadership? Work it out.
Michaela?
Yeah, so hopefully everybody's seen in the room that even though I'm an environmental scientist, I've actually not been alarmist in any way. If you can find a statement that I've made, come and see me later. But I've also not been insulting to anyone in the room. I don't think it's useful to insult people. I don't think it's helpful in the debate. And I actually don't like the polarization that creates. So personally, I am appealing to everyone to let's tone that down slightly and try to engage with each other, because we actually agree that we all want something better. We just don't agree on how we want to get there. So it'd be just really interesting to have maybe the debate without the insults and without the alarmist conversations. I think sovereign capability is the main thing for me. That's my main concern here. It's not really about carbon even. It's about understanding where our energy is going to come from and how we generate it. So I'd like to really talk about that a bit more. Distributed energy actually will result in less pylons, because when you're generating power locally, you can use it locally. And there are many cases where that happens already. In island scenarios and all sorts of different remote locations. It's completely possible. It's just that we haven't prioritized it. We've prioritized centralized power stations. When we tried to get rid of air pollution from cities, we centralized power generation into power stations that were outside of cities, and that was necessary at the time, but actually changed now. I think the policy approaches that we need to get better. They have to engage more scientists and women. And I would appeal to all women in the room to be engaged more in policy making, especially around technology, and to everyone should be demanding transparency and accountability around public spending.
Thank you very much. Finally, David.
I just want to answer the one question: what does a low-carbon good life look like? And I'm a bit worried that the low-carbon good life is the one that you were describing, Shahrar, which sounds rather bleak and unpleasant to me, if I'm honest. I know what a good life is. I know what I want to try and take the country to, which is a society where everybody can live lives of the fullest possible potential. And it isn't about more consumption. Growth is always sort of characterized as, people going to Walmart and buying more stuff. And it really isn't about that. I'm not interested, frankly, in localism, buying local, eating local, degrowth, cycling, sustainability, ultra-processed foods, all this sort of stuff. I'm not interested in it. I'm interested in human potential. I'm interested in growth, giving access to people, the best medical treatment, the best access to knowledge, the best material conditions to live and fulfill their own potential. I think that's what a good life is. Now, is that compatible with a low-carbon society? That's a very good question. I think it probably can be if we're using nuclear, new technologies, whatever. But for me, if it comes to a choice, I want a society where people live up to their potential, live richer, fuller, happier lives in line with what economic growth can deliver them. And I think that's what we should all be focusing on, to be honest.
Thank you very much indeed.